It begins with a single roll of silver-grey duct tape. In the conventional military world, tape is a logistical mundane. It is used to patch a torn rucksack, to bundle loose cables, or to mark a crate in a warehouse. But in the deep anaerobic humidity of the West African jungle, where the air itself feels like a wet lung and the vegetation is a physical obstacle to thought, duct tape is an instrument of survival. It is used to silence the metallic clink of a rifle sling. It is used to seal the muzzle of a weapon against the intrusive mud. It is used to bind the uniform tight against the skin to deny entry to leeches and burrowing insects. Most crucially, it is used to fix what the environment has broken. In the jungle, the machine always fails. The moisture rots the leather, the fungus eats the electronics, and the heat warp the plastic. Duct tape is the makeshift bridge between the broken machine and the completed mission. It is the silent fixer of a loud, decaying world. In September 2000, in the heart of Sierra Leone, a roll of silver duct tape was the only thing holding together the illusion of order. To the British military establishment, the deployment to Sierra Leone, Operation Barras, was originally envisioned as a limited, surgical evacuation of foreign nationals. It was a demonstration of ethical foreign policy, a way for a medium-sized European power to exert stabilizing influence on a disintegrating former colony without committing to a full-scale war. The British soldiers, primarily drawn from the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment and later the Royal Irish Regiment, were seen as the adult presence in a room full of traumatized children. They were professional, disciplined, and backed by the immense symbolic weight of the crown. The enemy, however, did not operate within the framework of European symbolic weight. The West Side Boys were not a military organization in any sense that a graduate of Sandhurst would recognize. They were a fractured, drugged, and deeply traumatized remnant of the Sierra Leone Civil War. Composed of former soldiers of the Sierra Leone Army and kidnapped child soldiers who had grown into violent young men, they occupied the Gaberibana and Magbeni villages on the banks of the Rokel Creek. Their leadership, headed by a man calling himself Colonel Cambodia, was a mixture of erratic warlordism and drug-induced paranoia. They wore looted civilian clothes, women's wigs, and bright makeup, believing in a form of juju, or black magic, that they thought rendered them invisible to bullets. To the Western eye, they appeared chaotic, almost farcical. But to the local population, they were a nightmare of absolute unpredictability. The collision between these two worlds, the high-precision British military machine and the drug-fueled chaos of the West Side Boys, was not a matter of if, but when. The machine and the ghost were destined to haunt the same river. This analysis is not merely a record of a battle. It is an investigation into what happens when a professional system meets a reality it refuses to believe in. If you find value in this clinical dissection of military history and the psychology of the sharp end, consider subscribing to the channel. We aim to respect the viewer's intelligence by avoiding the sensationalism of the shock and disaster narrative, focusing instead on the cold mechanics of causality. Leave a like if you believe that the most important stories in warfare are found in the details that the history books often redact. In the comments, I would be interested to hear your perspective. Is it possible for a disciplined army to truly stabilize an environment where the enemy's logic is driven by trauma rather than strategy? On the 25th of August, 2000, a patrol consisting of 11 men from the 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Regiment, and a Sierra Leonean liaison officer, Major Musa Bangura, left their base in Waterloo. They were led by Major Alan Marshall. Their mission was routine: to visit the Jordanian peacekeepers of the United Nations mission, UNAMSIL, and then to conduct a reconnaissance of the surrounding area. The Royal Irish Regiment is an elite infantry unit, but on this day they were operating under the Peacekeeping Illusion.
They were in Land Rovers, not armored vehicles. They were wearing berets, not helmets. They were carrying the weight of British prestige, which they assumed functioned as a barrier to aggression. Major Marshall decided to explore a track leading toward the village of Magbenny. This decision would later be scrutinized by every military board of inquiry for the next decade. Why would a professional officer take a small, lightly armed patrol into the heart of rebel territory? The answer was not incompetence. It was institutional inertia. For weeks, British patrols had moved through the region with relative impunity. The West Side boys had been erratic, but they had respected the Big Brother presence of the UK. Marshall believed that by showing the flag, he was maintaining the peace. He was operating on the logic of the previous week. He did not know that Colonel Cambodia was currently in a state of heightened, drug-induced paranoia, feeling that his power was being eroded by the very peace the British were trying to enforce. As the Land Rovers rounded a bend near the Rokel Creek, they were suddenly surrounded by over 100 West Side boys. This was the moment the waterproof map failed. In a conventional ambush, there is a clear sequence: the initial burst, the return fire, the maneuver. But here the West Side boys did not open fire. They swarmed the vehicles. They were screaming, waving AK-47s, their eyes glazed from brown, a mixture of cocaine and gunpowder snorted off the blade of a knife. They were acting with a frantic, unpredictable energy that neutralized the British training. Major Marshall faced an agonizing dilemma.
If he ordered his men to open fire, they would undoubtedly kill dozens of rebels, many of whom were clearly teenagers. But they were also outnumbered 10-1 at point-blank range. A firefight would have resulted in the total annihilation of his patrol. He chose to negotiate. He chose to believe that the contract of professional soldiering still applied. The West Side boys disarmed the British soldiers. They stripped them of their body armor, their radios, and their weapons. They forced the 11 elite soldiers and the Sierra Leonean major onto boats and took them across the creek to Barras. The capture of the Royal Irish 11 was a geopolitical catastrophe for the United Kingdom. It was the Black Hawk Down moment for the Blair government. The stabiliziruscia force had been turned into hostages. The adult in the room had been locked in the basement by the children. The news reached London within hours. In the secret planning rooms of the Ministry of Defence, the initial reaction was not panic, but a cold, mechanical recalibration. The British government began a two-track strategy: public diplomacy to buy time, and the immediate deployment of the Silent Edge, the Special Air Service, SAS, and the Special Boat Service, SBS. To the West Side boys, the capture of the British soldiers was a source of manic euphoria. They saw it as proof of their juju. They believed they had captured the crown itself. They began making absurd demands: a new government, the release of all prisoners, and more supplies. They were treating the British soldiers not as prisoners of war, but as bargaining chips in a game they didn't fully understand. But inside the jungle, the captured men were experiencing a rapid psychological transformation. Major Musa Bangura, the Sierra Leonean officer, was singled out for the most brutal treatment. The West Side boys saw him as a traitor to his own people. They beat him, starved him, and subjected him to mock executions. The British soldiers, locked in a dark, humid hut, had to listen to the screams of their liaison officer while being unable to act. The peacekeeping illusion had shattered. The 11 men were now facing the raw, unrefined reality of the jungle. They were being held by men whose logic was dictated by a combination of hallucinogenics and severe psychological trauma. There was no front line. There were no rules of engagement. There was only the heat, the smell of rotting vegetation, and the constant erratic threat of a drugged finger on a trigger. The captured men began to use their own duct tape philosophy. They realized that their only hope was to remain as a unit. They communicated in whispers. They maintained a secret discipline, refusing to let their captors see their fear. They were waiting for the sound that every special operations soldier in the world knows, the deep, rhythmic thumping of the Chinook rotors. They did not know that 400 miles to the south, in the Atlantic Ocean, the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious was already turning toward the coast of Sierra Leone. They did not know that C-130 transport planes were already landing in Dakar, carrying the men of the SASD squadron. The British military was preparing to fix what the environment and the bureaucracy had broken. They were preparing to use the silver duct tape of absolute violence to bundle the chaos into a grave. As we move into part 2, we will examine the intelligence void, how the SAS and SBS spent days in the jungle, meters away from the rebel camps, watching Colonel Cambodia eat and sleep. We will analyze the double ambush plan, and the moment the British government realized that diplomacy was merely a countdown to a massacre. The jungle is quiet, but the machine is waking up, and this time, it won't be wearing a beret. The retention of this story lies in the details of the rescue, but the tragedy lies in the capture. If you want to understand the true cost of the peacekeeping illusion, stay with us. The most classified part of the intelligence gathering is about to be revealed. To move through the primary rainforest of the Rokel Creek is to engage in a physical negotiation with an environment that refuses to recognize your presence. The vegetation is not merely a backdrop, it is a dense, multi-layered mesh of mangroves, raffia palms, and razor grass that creates a persistent, humid twilight even at midday. For a regular infantry unit, the jungle is an obstacle. For the Special Air Service, SAS, and the Special Boat Service, SBS, the jungle is a laboratory of technical concealment. As the sun set on the 31st of August, 2000, 4 small reconnaissance teams, 2 from the SAS and 2 from the SBS, were inserted into the swamps surrounding the Gaberi Bana and Magbeni villages. They did not arrive with the roar of engines. They drifted in on klepper canoes or swam through the brackish, tepid water of the creek, their skin coated in a mixture of camouflage cream and insect repellent. Once on the bank, the duct tape philosophy was applied with surgical precision. Every man sat in the total darkness of the undergrowth, performing a final sterilization of his equipment. They used silver-grey duct tape to secure the antennas of their PRC-117 radios. They taped the buckles of their webbing to prevent the sharp, plastic click that would resonate through the silent canopy. They taped over the reflective surfaces of their watches and compasses. In the jungle, silence is not an absence of sound. It is the active suppression of the mechanical. The reconnaissance teams were there to fill the intelligence void. In London, the Cabinet Office Briefing Room A, known as Cobra, was operating on satellite imagery and fragmented radio intercepts. But satellite imagery cannot see through triple canopy foliage. It cannot feel the morale of a hostage or the drug-induced volatility of a guard. The British government, led by Prime Minister Tony Blair, was publicly pursuing a diplomatic solution. Negotiations were being handled by a team of specialists who were offering Colonel Cambodia food, medicine, and political recognition in exchange for the 11 men of the Royal Irish Regiment. But the SAS teams in the bushes, positioned less than 30 meters from the rebel huts, were seeing a different reality. They observed the West Side boys through high-powered optics and thermal imagers. They saw the pattern of life in Gaberi Bana. It was a cycle of manic energy and sudden, heavy exhaustion. In the mornings, the rebels would snort their brown and parade through the village, firing their weapons into the air and shouting threats at the British Land Rovers they had captured. In the afternoons, as the heat reached 40 degrees and the drugs began to wear off, the village would descend into a lethargic, erratic stupor. The SAS observers noted the exact location of the hostages. The 11 British soldiers were held in a single, mud-walled hut near the center of Gberi Bana. Major Musa Bangura, the Sierra Leonean officer, had been moved to a separate structure, a pit, where he was being systematically tortured. The intelligence gathered by these four-man teams was clinical. They mapped the firing positions. They counted the RPG-7 launchers. They noted the lack of traditional military discipline. The West Side boys did not post sentries in a way that a Western soldier would recognize. Instead, they relied on alarm actors, individuals who would sit on the perimeter with a radio and a machete, their attention frequently drifting toward the next dose of narcotics. If you appreciate the granular, analytical approach to special operations and the dissection of intelligence-led warfare, please take a moment to subscribe and enable the notification bell. We focus on the causality of conflict, how a single observation in a swamp can dictate a geopolitical decision in a capital city. Leaving a like helps this channel grow, and in the comments, I'd be interested in your thoughts. At what point does a hostage negotiation become a tactical liability that justifies a suicide rescue mission? Your engagement allows us to maintain this level of unvarnished historical reporting. On the 3rd of September, the negotiations produced a breakthrough. 5 of the 11 British hostages, the youngest and most junior members of the patrol, were released. Colonel Cambodia viewed this as a gesture of strength, a way to show the world that he was a reasonable political actor. But for the British military, the release was a tactical windfall. The 5 men were immediately flown to the HMS Illustrious, anchored off the coast. There, they were met by D Squadron of the SAS. The debriefing was not a conversation. It was a technical reconstruction. The released soldiers provided the internal layout of the detention hut. They identified the primary guards. They confirmed the deteriorating mental state of their captors. Most importantly, they reported the deadline. Colonel Cambodia was losing patience. His demands for a national government were being ignored by London. He had begun to threaten the execution of the remaining 6 hostages, starting with Major Alan Marshall. He told the negotiators that if his supplies, meaning more drugs and weapons, were not delivered within days, the Royal Irish would begin to bleed. Inside the Cobra meeting in London, the Peacekeeping Illusion was officially terminated. The British government realized that diplomacy was no longer a tool for rescue. It was a distraction to keep the West Side boys stationary while the machine prepared its strike. The plan was designated Operation Barras. Operation Barras was a no-fail mission of extreme complexity. The objective was the simultaneous neutralization of 2 separate villages, Gberi Bana and Magbeni, separated by the Rokel Creek. Gberi Bana held the hostages. Magbeni held the bulk of the West Side boys' heavy weapons and their primary barracks. If only Gberi Bana was attacked, the rebels in Magbeni would simply fire their mortars across the river, incinerating the hostages and the rescue force before they could exfiltrate. The force consisted of D Squadron 22 SAS, elements of the Special Boat Service, and a company of the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 1 Para. The 1 Para soldiers were the Hammer. Their job was to assault Magbeni, create a massive noisy diversion, and destroy the rebels' heavy equipment. The SAS and SBS were the Scalpel. Their job was to fast rope directly onto the detention hut in Gberi Bana, extract the 6 British soldiers and Major Bangura, and be gone in less than 5 minutes. The primary technological challenge was the Chinook problem. The Boeing CH-47 Chinook is a massive, twin-rotor heavy-lift helicopter. It is essential for moving a company of paratroopers, but it is also incredibly loud. The sound of a Chinook can be heard for miles in the still air of the jungle.
If the West Side boys heard the helicopters approaching, they would have at least 90 seconds to execute the hostages before the SAS hit the ground. The pilots of the 7th Squadron, RAF, developed a high-risk solution. They would fly nap of the earth, skimming the surface of the Rokel Creek at a height of less than 10 meters. They would use the acoustic shadow of the riverbanks and the dense jungle to mask the sound of the rotors until the very last second. This required the pilots to fly through a narrow, winding canyon of vegetation in near total darkness, using night vision goggles, NVGs, that offered a grainy, limited field of view.
One mistake, a rotor blade clipping a mangrove branch or a sudden shift in wind, would result in a catastrophic crash that would end the mission before it began. The SAS teams on the ground in the swamps were the final link. They were given the task of Positive Target Identification, PTID. On the morning of September 10th, they would confirm that the hostages were still in the hut. If the hostages were moved at the last second, the recon teams would have to relay the new coordinates instantly, or the rescue force would descend onto an empty building. The psychological state of the SAS operators in those final hours was one of honed aggression. They had been in the swamp for days. They were covered in leeches. Their skin was rotting from the immersion foot caused by the persistent dampness. They had watched the West Side boys subject Major Bangura to unimaginable cruelty. They were no longer peacekeepers. They were the instruments of a state that had been insulted. The duct tape was now on the muzzles of their weapons. They had taped over their flashlights, leaving only a pinhole of light. They had checked their grenades and their HKMP5s. They were waiting for the 0615 H hour. Inside Barras, the West Side boys were sleeping off a night of drugged celebration. Colonel Cambodia was in his hut, his AK-47 leaning against the wall. He believed he was the most powerful man in Sierra Leone. He believed his juju protected him. He believed the British were afraid of him. He was operating on a logic of the past. He did not know that 40 miles away, 3 Chinook helicopters were lifting off from the deck of the HMS Illustrious, their rotors biting into the humid air, their cargo bays filled with 400 years of regimental history and a cold, modern desire for retribution. As the helicopters began their low-level run over the Rokel Creek, the SAS recon teams in the grass tightened their grip on their weapons. They could hear the faint, distant thumping. The acoustic shadow was holding. The West Side boys did not hear the machines. They did not see the shadows moving in the mangroves. But the silent edge was now less than 3 miles away, and the first shot of Operation Barras was about to be fired, not by a paratrooper, but by a sniper in a swamp who had been watching his target for 96 hours. As we move into Part 3, we will witness the 11-minute inferno. We will analyze the door-breaching mechanics, the hand-to-hand struggle inside the detention hut, and the moment the parachute regiment turned Magbeni into a graveyard. The machine is here. The duct tape is about to be shredded by the muzzle flash. At 6:16 a.m. on the 10th of September, the silence of the Rokel Creek did not merely break. It was structurally dismantled. The acoustic shadow that the RAF pilots had maintained for 40 miles evaporated the millisecond the 3 Chinook helicopters flared over the villages of Barras and Magbeni. A Chinook in a high-performance flare is a mechanical monster. The twin rotors, biting into the thick, humid air to arrest 90 knots of forward momentum, create a downwash of over 100 miles per hour. It flattens the elephant grass, strips the leaves from the mangroves, and sends a localized hurricane of dust and swamp debris into the lungs of anyone standing below. The first shot of Operation Barras was fired by an SAS sniper positioned in the swamp,
less than 40 meters from a rebel heavy machine gun nest on the perimeter of Barras. He had been watching the gunner through his thermal optics for 4 days. He knew the man's breathing pattern. He knew the exact moment the gunner would reach for his radio. The sniper's suppressed rifle spoke once, a hollow thud barely audible over the approaching rotodrone. The rebel gunner slumped over his Soviet-made DSHK before he could even look toward the river. The positive target identification was confirmed.
The silent edge had become the ballistic threshold. As the lead Chinook hovered at 15 feet over the center of Barras, the scalpel of D Squadron SAS began to fast rope into the village. To the West Side boys waking up in their huts, the world had become a sensory nightmare. They emerged into a village filled with the blinding white light of magnesium flares and the deafening, bone-shaking roar of the helicopters. The drug-induced stupor of the night before was replaced by a frantic primal terror. Some rebels began to fire their AK-47s blindly into the air, screaming about demons coming from the sky. Others, fueled by a final desperate dose of brown, ran toward the sound of the rotors, believing their juju would stop the 5.56mm rounds already moving toward them. If you are beginning to appreciate the visceral reality of a no-fail special operations mission, where seconds are the difference between a geopolitical triumph and a national tragedy, please consider subscribing to the channel. We analyze military history with a focus on the cold mechanics of the sharp end, respecting the intelligence of the viewer by avoiding the sensationalism of the shock narrative. Leave a like if you value this level of research, and in the comments, I would be interested in your thoughts. Does the overwhelming use of force in a hostage situation save lives by paralyzing the enemy, or does it risk a trigger-happy disaster? Your engagement allows us to sustain this flagship-level analysis. The SAS operators hit the ground and transitioned instantly into their room-clearing motor patterns. The detention hut was the primary objective. The 4-man entry team moved with a clinical, predatory grace. They did not use the doors. They used explosive frame charges to turn the mud walls into dust. They entered through the holes they had just made, their HK-MP5s up, their flashlights creating a strobe-like disorientation in the smoke.
British Army, stay down! Stay down!
Inside the hut, the remaining 6 hostages of the Royal Irish Regiment were lying on the floor, their hands over their heads, exactly as they had been instructed during the secret radio transmissions in the days prior. The SAS operator stepped over them, identifying the guards in the corners of the room. The engagements were measured in milliseconds. 3 rebels were neutralized in the detention hut before they could raise their weapons. Major Alan Marshall looked up to see a man in a black respirator and a camouflaged uniform, his eyes cold and focused behind the glass. The SAS operator did not offer a handshake or a word of comfort. He checked the major's face against his mental ID card, tapped him on the shoulder, and signaled his team to begin the extraction. But Barras was only half the battle. Across the Rokel Creek, in the village of Magbeni, the hammer was striking. The company of 1 para had descended from their own Chinooks into a literal inferno. Magbeni was the military heart of the West Side boys, containing their ammunition dumps and their heavy weapons. The paratroopers faced a much more organized resistance. The rebels here had not been as drugged as their counterparts in Barras. They were the hard core of the organization. The paratroopers moved in a classic infantry assault formation, using the overwhelming firepower of their general-purpose machine guns, GPMGs, and LMG Minimis to suppress the rebel huts. The sound was a continuous, rhythmic hammering that drowned out even the helicopters. The West Side boys in Magbeni fought back with a suicidal ferocity. They fired RPG-7 rockets at the hovering Chinooks, one of which narrowly missed the cockpit of a helicopter as it was dropping reinforcements.
The one-para soldiers were not there to rescue. They were there to negate the threat. They moved through Magbeni with a controlled aggression, destroying the captured Land Rovers and blowing up the ammunition caches. The silver duct tape on their equipment was now scorched and blackened by the heat of their own muzzle flashes. Back in Geberi Bana, the SAS had found the missing link, Major Musa Bangura. They found him in a separate pit, nearly naked, his body covered in the marks of systematic torture. He was too weak to walk. An SAS operator, a man trained for the absolute application of violence, gently lifted the Sierra Leonean major onto his shoulders. The solidarity of the Legionnaire's code, or the thinking soldier's ethics, didn't matter in that moment. It was the raw human commitment of a professional to a man who had been broken in the service of the machine. But as the extraction began, the environment struck its final blow. A group of West Side boys, hidden in a dense thicket of mangroves near the extraction LZ, opened fire on the SAS team as they were moving the hostages toward the helicopters. It was a cyclic ambush, a frantic, undisciplined spray of lead that hit the center of the SAS formation. Trooper Bradley Tinian, a 28-year-old SAS operator, was struck in the initial burst. In a special operations mission, a man down is the ultimate test of the unit's psychological threshold. The mission does not stop. The extraction does not pause. The SAS operators returned fire with a devastating accuracy, neutralizing the mangrove position in seconds, while the medic began working on Tinian in the middle of the LZ, his hands covered in blood and swamp mud. The hostages were bundled into the Chinooks. The SAS recon teams emerged from the swamps, their duct tape camouflage now shredded by the thorns and the mud. They were the last men on the ground.
As the helicopters pulled pitch and accelerated away from the burning villages, the operators looked back at Geberi Bana and Magbeni. The West Side Boys, as a military organization, had ceased to exist in exactly 20 minutes. Colonel Cambodia had been captured in his underwear, his juju powerless against a flashbang and a suppressed carbine. The price of the peacekeeping illusion had been paid. The Royal Irish 11 were safe. Major Bangura was alive. But Bradley Tinian was dying in the back of a Chinook. The silver duct tape on his medical kit, the only thing left to patch a hole that the world would never truly understand. If this analysis of the high-stakes reality and the human cost of special operations provides a new perspective on military history, please leave a comment with your thoughts. How should the nation honor the disposable soldier who dies in a war that officially never happened? Your interaction signals the algorithm to support this type of unsensationalized, detail-heavy content. Subscribe so you do not miss the final part of our investigation. In the final part of this documentary, we will examine the aftermath of the fix. We will analyze the clinical, cold results of Operation Barras and how the West Side Boys were not just defeated, but erased from the social fabric of Sierra Leone. We will see the return of the Royal Irish Regiment to their base and the quiet, anonymous funeral of a man whose name was redacted until the mission was complete. The machine has fixed the problem. The duct tape has been removed. But the jungle is already growing back over the craters. The interior of a Boeing CH-47 Chinook in the immediate wake of a high-intensity extraction is a space of concentrated sensory overload. It is a vibrating, oil-scented cavern of green-tinted light and hydraulic shrieks. On the floor, the silver-grey duct tape that had been used to secure the troop seats and the medical litters is now peeling under the weight of saturated combat gear and the slick, dark reality of trauma. There is no cheering. There is no sense of mission accomplished. There is only the clinical, frantic rhythm of the combat medics and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of men who have just transitioned from the peak of an adrenaline-fueled center peel into the hollow exhaustion of the aftermath.
In the back of the lead helicopter, Trooper Bradley Tinian was the center of a desperate, manual struggle against biology. He had been struck in the abdomen and leg during the final seconds of the extraction from Barras. In the world of the thinking soldier, a casualty is a logistical and psychological data point. The medics did not see a hero. They saw a series of hemorrhages that needed to be clamped. They used the same silver duct tape to reinforce the pressure bandages, trying to hold the man's life together with the same makeshift fixer that had silenced their weapons. Tinian's heart stopped as the Chinook crossed the coastline of Sierra Leone. He was 28 years old. He had survived the SAS selection, the jungle training in Belize, and 4 days in the swamps of Rokel Creek. He was the only British military fatality of Operation Barras. In the cold mathematics of special operations, one life in exchange for 26 hostages and the total destruction of a rebel army is considered a successful ratio. But for the men of D Squadron, the ratio was an abstraction. The loss was a structural defect in the unit. The peacekeeping illusion had been replaced by a surgical erasure. If you are beginning to understand the profound, often silent cost of maintaining a nation's strategic prestige, please consider subscribing to the channel. We analyze these moments of institutional friction with an objective, detail-oriented lens, moving past the cinematic tropes to find the cold truth of the military machine. Leave a like if you value this level of research, and in the comments, I would be interested in your analysis. Can a special operations unit truly recover from a successful mission that costs the life of one of its own? Or does the loss permanently alter the unit's DNA? While the Chinooks were transiting to the hospital ship, the hammer of one para was still finishing the work in Magbeni. The village had been turned into a scorched earth laboratory of infantry lethality. The paratroopers had moved through every structure with a systematic, aggressive momentum. They were not there to arrest the West Side boys, they were there to dismantle the infrastructure. They found the heavy weapons that had paralyzed the region for months, Soviet-designed 82mm mortars, SPG-9 recoilless rifles, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They used plastic explosives to turn these weapons into scrap metal. They burned the captured Land Rovers. They destroyed the brown processing areas. The capture of Colonel Cambodia was the ultimate demonstration of the collapse of the rebel juju. The warlord who had threatened to bleed the Royal Irish was found hiding under a bed in his hut, stripped of his women's wigs and his makeup, shivering in the dust. He was not a revolutionary leader. He was a terrified, drug-addicted young man who had been outthought and outfought by a system that did not recognize his magic. The SAS and one para had killed over 150 West Side boys in 20 minutes. The rebel organization did not merely retreat, it evaporated. The survivors fled into the deep jungle, where they were eventually hunted down by the Sierra Leonean army or surrendered to the UN. The West Side Boys, as a geopolitical entity, was erased from the map of West Africa by the application of 11 minutes of concentrated British violence. However, as the smoke cleared over Rokel Creek, a new kind of friction was beginning to heat up in the air-conditioned rooms of London. The British Foreign Office and the ethical foreign policy wing of the government were experiencing a state of institutional shock. Operation Barras had been a spectacular success, but it had also been a total war solution to a peacekeeping problem. The sheer scale of the rebel casualties and the aggressive nature of the assault were difficult to reconcile with the public image of the UK as a stabilizing humanitarian force. There was an internal debate about the necessity of force. Some bureaucrats argued that the SAS had been too aggressive, that Colonel Cambodia could have been talked down. They viewed the mission through the lens of a legal negotiation. The SAS command in Hereford viewed the mission through the lens of the contract. They argued that once a British soldier was taken hostage and tortured, the peacekeeping illusion was null and void. The environment had demanded a fix, and they had delivered it.
To the SAS, the 150 dead rebels were not a tragedy. They were the necessary debris of a successful tactical resolution. This friction highlights the fundamental disconnect between the machine in the capital and the edge in the jungle. The capital wants the results of violence without the aesthetics of blood. The edge understands that you cannot have one without the other. The silver duct tape on the equipment was now being peeled off back at the staging base in Hastings. The sterilization was being reversed. The SAS operators were reclaiming their identities, their badges, and their names. But the residue of the tape remained, the sticky, tenacious adhesive that is almost impossible to remove. For the 11 men of the Royal Irish Regiment, the residue of the capture would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had been erased in a different way. They had been stripped of their pride, their weapons, and their authority by a group of drugged teenagers. Even though they had been rescued, the psychological mottle of the capture could not be entirely patched over. Major Alan Marshall would eventually leave the army. Major Musa Bangura, the Sierra Leonean officer who had endured the worst of the torture, would spend years recovering from the physical and mental scars. The Royal Irish Regiment's reputation was fixed by the SAS, but the individuals who were in the Land Rovers that day remained the silent victims of the Peacekeeping Illusion. This is the moral attrition of the Special Operations soldier. They are sent to fix the mistakes of the bureaucracy, and they do so with a clinical, objective lethality. But who fixes the soldier? As we move into the final part of this documentary, we will analyze the strategic echo of Operation Barras. We will look at how the SAS used the lessons of the Rokel Creek to refine their jungle-urban tactics for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We will see the quiet, anonymous burial of Bradley Tinian, and the moment the silver duct tape became a symbol of a generation of special operations that operated in the gray zones of the new millennium. The jungle has grown back over Barras. The huts are gone. The river flows as it always did. But the silent edge is still out there, sitting in the dark, waiting for the next roll of tape to be unspooled. The machine is ready. The contract is still active. It is a quiet, meticulously maintained cemetery in the city of Hereford, not far from the high walls of the SAS headquarters at Stirling Lines. There are no towering obelisks here, no grand triumphal arches, and no eternal flames. The headstones are uniform, made of simple Portland stone, weathered by the persistent English rain. On one of these stones, the name Bradley Tinian is engraved beneath the winged dagger of the Special Air Service. There is no mention of Rokel Creek. There is no description of the Acoustic Shadow or the 11-minute firestorm in Barras. There is only a date, September 10th, 2000. To the casual visitor, this is a grave of a young soldier. To the regiment, it is a redacted reality. Tinian's death was the friction point where the silver duct tape of the mission finally tore. He was the price paid for the fix. While the British government celebrated the miracle of Operation Barras as a triumph of liberal interventionism, the SAS treated it as a technical debrief. They returned to Hereford, peeled the silver tape from their equipment, and faced the residue, the sticky, tenacious adhesive that remains long after the mission is over. The residue of Operation Barras is the final, most profound chapter of the story. It is the lasting impact of those 11 minutes on the DNA of the British Special Forces and the fate of a nation that had been bleeding for a decade. To understand the strategic fix that occurred in the wake of the raid, one must look at the total collapse of the Sierra Leone Civil War. For 10 years, the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, and various splinter groups like the West Side Boys had operated under a sense of absolute impunity. They believed that the international community was paralyzed by the peacekeeping illusion.
that the UN and the British were paper tigers who would negotiate, provide aid, and retreat at the first sign of real violence. Operation Barras killed that belief. The speed, the aggression, and the absolute lethality of the SAS and one para acted as a psychological centerpeel for the entire country. When the word spread through the jungle that the West Side Boys, the most erratic and feared gang in the region, had been annihilated in 20 minutes by a force that came from the sky, the RUF leadership experienced a state of catastrophic shock. Their juju was dead. Their leverage was gone. Within months of the raid, the RUF began to disarm. The war that had claimed 50,000 lives did not end with a grand treaty. It ended because the Silent Edge had demonstrated that there was no gray zone left to hide in. If you have stayed with us through this hour-long flagship investigation into the clinical reality of special operations, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. We analyze these moments of institutional friction to understand the hidden mechanics of history, how the decision of a few men in a swamp can alter the destiny of millions. In the final comments of this series, I invite your perspective. In the 21st century, is surgical violence the only effective tool for ending eternal wars? Or does it merely create a new kind of dependency on elite units? Your engagement allows us to continue this level of rigorous, objective storytelling. But while the strategic result was a success, the institutional residue within the SAS was more complex. Operation Barras was the final mission of the post-colonial era for the regiment. It was the last time they would be used as the firemen of Africa in a localized brushfire conflict. The lessons learned over the Rokel Creek, the use of acoustic shadows, the refinement of jungle-urban room clearing, and the integration of SAS scalpels with parachute regiment hammers became the foundational blueprints for the wars that were about to ignite. In September 2000, the SAS was a unit of approximately 300 men operating on the fringes of British foreign policy. Exactly 1 year later, on September 11, 2001, the Duct Tape was unspooled for a conflict of industrial scale.
The men who fast-roped into Beribana were the same men who would lead the first reconnaissance teams into the Hindu Kush and the first sabotage patrols into the Iraqi desert. They took the duct tape philosophy with them. This philosophy, the thinking soldier's ability to fix a broken machine in a hostile environment, became the defining characteristic of the SAS during the global war on terror. However, Operation Barras also exposed the budgetary friction that defines the British Special Operations community. While their American counterparts in Delta Force or SEAL Team 6 were beginning to receive billions of dollars in technological saturation, GPS wrist mounts, personalized drones, and experimental weaponry, the SAS in Sierra Leone were still relying on manual navigation, paper maps, and silver duct tape. This led to a unique efficiency per man ratio. The SAS learned to do with a 4-man team what the American military machine often required a company to achieve. This was not because the British were braver, but because their architecture of attrition was more refined. They could not afford the machine, so they perfected the man. The silver duct tape was the symbol of this austere excellence, the ability to bind the mission together through raw skill and makeshift ingenuity. This brings us to the psychological residue left on the individuals. Major Alan Marshall and the men of the Royal Irish Regiment lived with the motto of their capture for the rest of their lives. In the military hierarchy, there is an unspoken stigma of the hostage. No matter how successful the rescue, the fact remains that the peacekeeping illusion failed them. They had been erased by a drugged enemy, and that erasure is a psychological wound that no medal or debriefing can truly heal. Major Musa Bangura, the Sierra Leonean officer,
became a symbol of national resilience in his country.
But his story is a reminder that the surgical strike only saves the life. It does not erase the torture that preceded it. He remained a man held together by the duct tape of his own will, living in a nation that was fixed by a foreign force he could never fully explain to his neighbors. And then there is the residue on the regiment itself. The SAS is an institution built on institutional humility and absolute anonymity. Bradley Tinian's name is on a wall, but his specific actions that day are still redacted in the official logs. The Silent Edge operates in a space where the state takes the credit for the success and the unit absorbs the cost of the failure. This creates a unique, subterranean culture, a brotherhood of men who are bound together by the secrets they can never tell and the silver tape they can never fully clean off their gear. The through-line metaphor of the silver duct tape reaches its philosophical conclusion here. In the jungle, the tape is a fixer. It binds the broken plastic of a radio. It silences the metal of a rifle. It seals the muzzle against the mud. It is a temporary, makeshift solution to a persistent, decaying reality. This is exactly what special operations are for the modern state. When the peacekeeping illusion breaks, when the bureaucracy fails, when the machine of diplomacy is warped by the heat of a crisis, the state calls the SAS to tape it back together. Operation Barras was a duct tape solution. It didn't fix the underlying causes of the Sierra Leone civil war, the poverty, the diamonds, the regional instability. It simply bound the crisis together long enough for the nation to stop bleeding. It fixed the immediate problem of the Royal Irish 11 so that the machine of state could continue to function. But duct tape is not a permanent weld. It is a temporary bridge. As we conclude this flagship investigation into the Silent Edge and the 11-minute inferno, we are left with the image of a soldier sitting in the dark of a Chinook, his hands covered in the sticky residue of a mission that officially never happened. He is the thinking soldier. He is the man who understands that in a world of high-tech sensors and billion-dollar satellites, the final outcome of a war still depends on a roll of tape, a suppressed carbine, and the willingness to walk into a drug-fueled nightmare at 6:16 in the morning. The silver tape is still in the rucksack. The muzzles are still sealed. The acoustic shadow is still being studied in the halls of Hereford and Fort Bragg. The machine will break again. The environment will rot the sensors. The bureaucracy will fall for the next peacekeeping illusion. And when it does, the Silent Edge will be there, sitting in the humidity of the next jungle, waiting to unspool the tape. Operation Barras was the moment the British state realized that it could not survive without its ghosts. And the ghosts realized that they could not survive without the contract. The edge is silent. The residue is permanent. Thank you for watching this hour-long documentary on the most clinical and successful hostage rescue in British military history. We are a community of individuals who value the unvarnished truth of the sharp end. Stay with us as we continue to dissect the world's most enigmatic units and the men who walk through the dark.